Hi everyone, one of the top asked questions on my stream is always, how can I know when an item is an upgrade? How can I compare items when they have different item powers? How much item power more is worth it to equip, for example, for a weapon? And I want to make this video here to help you guys help yourself. So the math is a bit complicated, but on the other hand, if you know a bit of like a rule of thumb for a few things, you can definitely figure out what is the best choice for your character at any given moment, quite reliably at least. So I have prepared 3 different setups here. So we have a rogue, we have a sorc, and we have a barb here. So these are all the builds I've played as well. And I have prepared a few different weapons here, in particular weapons, because those are probably the most mysterious in terms of like how much is an upgrade actually worth it. For typical armor slots, etc., I guess it's generally relatively straightforward. Okay, you see the stats, there's not really much to it. And similar here, you can kind of figure out like what are more defensive stats than others. But for the weapons, there is also the DPS component that plays a role here. And sometimes you just don't get the weapons that have the right stats for you. So I want to tell you how you can figure out what you should actually wear. Now, figuring out what is actually a good item or not may not be only important for yourself, but also if you want to trade the item to someone else. And this is exactly where the sponsor of today's video comes in, Diablo.trade. This is a new Diablo 4 trading platform that is free to use and free of real money trade, or RMT. It's only using in-game gold for you to sell and buy items for other players. It's very simple to use. You can go onto this website, you can sign up with your Battle.net ID, or you can connect your Discord account as well. All you have to do is go into the game, take a screenshot of the item, for example with the snippet tool. In my case on Windows, I just do Windows, Shift and S. I can cut it out and then paste it into the website for listing the item. They have an image recognition tool that automatically generates the item from the one from your screenshot and populates all of the stats. You just select the game mode where you're playing, like seasonal hardcore, seasonal softcore, or something like that, and then press on submit after putting in the price. Since I have connected my Battle.net and Discord accounts there, I can just get a message from a potential buyer, and we meet up in town in Kyovashad, for example. Make sure the crossplay settings match, else you can't see or talk to each other. Then you make a party, do the trade, get the gold, and that's it. And lastly, of course, mark the item as sold on the site. If you're looking to get rid of some of those leftover items that you don't use for your build, but they are still really good for maybe other people, this is definitely the way to go. Or you can just go on the site, filter by whatever stats you want to have on your dream item, and see if anyone has it for you. On top of this, you can also find consumables on the site, where if you try to gear up for your high-end Nightmare Dungeon pushes, or Uber Delve attempts, or anything else, you can find anything that you need for your build. And last but not least, Diablo.trade is also giving away a Steam Deck for the first 5,000 people that list an item on the website. So go there, try it out, and you have a chance to win the Steam Deck. Now let's go back to the video. So let's jump in here with our first example, the Rogue. We have the Rapid Gladius, and we have 2 different versions of this. Here's an 800 item power version that has overpower, daze, close, and dexterity. And we have a second one here that's a 750 item power that has vulnerable, crit, close, dex. Basically the best in slot stats for any melee rogue build. So now comes the question, which of these is actually better? Now, a few things you need to know when you start comparing these items is you need to roughly understand the value of these different stats. For example, vulnerable. This is the rogue. You are expected to have vulnerable up basically at all times, in any combat. So this is number 1. Vulnerable is really powerful on the rogue in particular because everything is always vulnerable. And well, you can stack a lot of vulnerable and it's a separate damage multiplier. I actually forgot to make this 5 upgrades here, so let's do that. So we have the full maximum value, and this has 21% vulnerable damage. Now here on the side, you can see this build has 250% vulnerable damage bonus. This means you have to add this 250% to plus 100, so a total of 350% damage done to vulnerable targets. So this means that an increase of around 21% is probably something like in a range of 7% or so. So if we, for example, calculate this, we have 354 total. And now we divide this by a number 21% less. That will be 333. Yeah, it's 6.3% damage increase from this one stat. So again, the calculation is you have 100% base, and then you have all of the vulnerable added to that 100. So 100 plus 254. Yeah, in that case, we have this number, and then we can just subtract the number on this item to see how it would be without that stat. Again, you have to divide this like this. There's a calculation. So it's 6.3% higher. And we can kind of do a similar calculation with some of the other stats. For example, the crit or the close, etc. So the thing is that the vulnerable damage values are a little bit different depending on the build, depending on the class. A rogue, for example, generally has rather a high vulnerable. Barb has even more vulnerable damage because they have 4 weapons. You can stack vulnerable in so many slots. And other classes like the Sorcs, they don't really have all that much vulnerable damage. So for example, see here my Sorc build only has it on the 2 rings and maybe the weapon, and the vulnerable damage is only plus 132. So adding some vulnerable stat on the Sorc is much more impactful than it is on the Rogue, because the Rogue already has so much of it. So a general rule of thumb is that if you stack more of the same stat, the further increases become less valuable relative to before. When you have no vulnerable damage bonuses at all, and you stack like plus 100% vulnerable, it's much more impactful than if you stack plus 100% when you already have 300. It's pretty straightforward. The good thing is that here in the default planner, if you have like a full build setup, then you can also see these values here on the side. You have the vulnerable damage there. You have all of the additive damage categories here. So all of these are the additive category. And again, the typical endgame builds here have something like between plus 500 to plus 700% additive damage or so. That also depends a little bit on what build exactly, what class exactly. But you can see here if we add up, for example, all damage, and then damage to elites, damage to crowd control, close, healthy, injured, physical, dual wield, core. This is all the same damage multiplier. All of this is in the additive category. And if you add those numbers up, it's like around 300, 600, and then a bit more, like around plus 700 or so. So the total damage done, again, is 100 base plus 700. So this rogue here would have roughly 800% damage in this all damage category. And it's kind of similar for the other classes. This actually doesn't change too much between the classes, like the vulnerable damage. There can be quite some ups and downs. But as you see here, for example, on the Sorc, we have elite, it's like 60, there's like 180, 310, 350, 500, around 700 as well, maybe a bit more, close to 800. So this Sorc would be sitting at something like 800 to 900. This rogue here is something like 800, and then I guess for the Barb will be also somewhat similar. So this depends a little bit on the items, this depends a bit on your paragon choices, your glyphs. A lot of these glyphs have additive damage bonuses, for example, such as the territorial glyph here, damage to close targets. So depending on what are your choices in your build, the relative value shifts a little bit. But the point I'm getting at here is that, for example, with this weapon, again, we have a pretty juicy chunk of close damage on this weapon here. So you see here 35% close damage, and we can do the same calculation that I just did with vulnerable. So again, let's say this rogue has 100 plus 700 roughly the additive category, so the 800 total. And again, we can divide this by a number that is 35% less than 800. So in that case, you do 765. And you see here that this damage to close enemies is an increase of roughly 4.6%. So you cut off this 1.0, and then you have 4.5% basically, or 4.6 with rounding. So this is the damage increase of this stat. So now we know that the vulnerable is worth roughly 6.5, the close is roughly 4.5, so the close is a bit worse. But again, vulnerable has the condition, close has another condition, arguably. And then there's also the crit, and the crit is kind of the same story. So you can see here the crit chance is like 42%, and then the crit damage is like 370. So again, this is the bonus, this is not the total. So we start with 100 plus 371. So this is the total damage done on a crit, 471% damage, almost times 5. And if you want to calculate the value of this critical strike damage, then at least for a crit, you can calculate it quite easily. We divide this by a number 26% less. And that would be, well, math is hard, so minus 26. Okay, here we go. Divided by 445. So yeah, this is roughly 5.8%. Now you have to see that this is actually not exactly 5.8% damage increase, because you have also non-crits, and the non-crits are not affected by this crit damage at all. But realistically, for most cases, you see that, you know, crits do something like ×4, ×5 of your damage. So if you don't crit, you usually just don't really do any noticeable damage whatsoever, and you can kind of like almost ignore non-crits. But of course, in this case, the value would be maybe around 5% or so DPS, because the non-crits still contribute a little bit. So if we add up all of these stats now, we had 4.6%, and then plus 6.3%, and plus 5%. So those three stats, let's ignore the dexterity here, those three stats give us roughly 16% extra damage. And this means that you could have an item that has 16% more damage than this sword, but has no other stat that does anything for your build besides dexterity, and it will be around equal. So for example, we have 1042 damage per second here. So if you take 1042 times 1.16, the sword that would beat this would be 1208 DPS. So as an example, I created this item here that has 800 item power plus 25. It has 1267 DPS, so it's already higher than this required value here. And I also added damage to dazed, overpower damage, and it has close and dex. So I kept the close and dex just like on the other weapon. So you see here, close dex, and then this has vulnerable and crit, which is really good. And this one has overpower and daze, both of which are pretty bad. Especially overpower for rogue basically does nothing. And then you have daze, which, well, in the case of this build is also not exactly a very prominent feature. So we have, for example, a way to proc daze, but it's not really consistently up on all targets. It doesn't work on bosses, so it's generally more on the weaker side. So, for example, the close is always active. That's a good one. And daze has the same value, and it's up, you know, maybe 20% of the time or so, let's say. So it's almost worthless. In any case, based on the calculations that we were doing, we needed an item that has only dexterity and no other stats and 1208 DPS. So you see here with the plus 50 item power, this item is already significantly better than this sword. And if it has any kind of decent stats, it is still much better. So this would probably be something like a, I would say 15% DPS increase or so over a 750 item power item. So it's a pretty significant jump, despite the 750 item power sword having basically the best in slot stats, and this one having two stats that are generally relatively bad. Now here comes another consideration though, and that is that this is a dual wield build. And this means that the effect of the DPS increase of this weapon is actually half as much, because, well, there's two weapons and you count both of these together, and then you have to look at the relative increase of the combined value of DPS. So in that case, the value of the stats is actually more improved than it is on other builds where you have like only one weapon, for example. So for example, if you play a Necromancer with one hand and shield, then the impact of the weapon DPS is basically twice as much. And similar when you have a two-handed weapon. So in the case of a dual wield build, let's say we just assume that both these weapons have the same DPS. They have 1267. Let's combine this to 2500 combined in one DPS value, because this is how the game adds up both of these items together. They just combine the DPS. So in that case, you would have the high item power weapons with a total of 2500 DPS. And if you replace one of the weapons with a lower DPS weapon, like this one is 1042 plus 1267, so we can combine this to 2300. So if you divide these two numbers, then we see that with the higher DPS sword, we have a roughly 8.7% extra DPS. And, well, in that case, actually it becomes much closer between the weapons, as you can see. So previously we said that, you know, we have like roughly 16% extra damage with those stats, vulnerable, crit, close, compared to some other stats that don't really do that much. Well, this case also has close, but vuln and crit are gone. And we said earlier this was 6.3 and 5, so roughly an 11% difference. And you see now for these dual wield cases that it is actually much closer. So 11% increase from the stats, 8% increase from the item power, from the DPS value of the sword. So the 750 item power sword almost beats this 800 item power sword, which already has two pretty decent stats on it, and then two kind of useless stats. And this makes it so that whenever I recommend a rule of thumb to people asking me about these item choices, that I say that roughly 15 to 20 item power is worth like one good stat or so on a weapon. So again, you know, if this was like, let's say a 760 or so item power sword, so if you made this 760, this would have a bit more DPS, so this would be 1082 instead of 1040. And then we would kind of get to the territory where it breaks about even. So maybe a bit more item power, and then like maybe a 770 item power sword with those stats would beat this 800 plus 25 sword here. So it's a roughly 15 to 20 item power per good stat, like the priority stats like vulnerable and crit. And then some of those other stats like close, core, they are usually worth a bit less. So maybe in that case, the item power difference has to be a bit more significant, like 20 to 25. But this is roughly the value here. Now we can do a second example with a two-handed weapon where we don't have this impact of like a second weapon coming in or so. But the calculation is pretty similar because this two-handed weapon has pretty much a similar DPS value as the combined one-handed weapons. You see here, this is an 800 item power crossbow, and it has 2534 damage per second. So this is pretty similar to what we had here on these one-handed weapons. And all the stats are basically doubled as well. So you have exactly the same calculation, the stats are doubled and the DPS is doubled. So this means that the relative value between DPS and the stats is actually unchanged. So again, here we can have this example, the 800 crossbow has damage to slowed, which is pretty useless on this build. Basic skill damage is entirely useless. Ultimate skill damage is entirely useless. And dex. So I chose this combination of stats because it's basically all useless. And well, dexterity is something that you always roll on first try when you rolled at your cultist if dex is not already present. So you're always expected to have at least your main stat on the weapon. And then we can compare this to, let's say, the 750 crossbow here, where you have vulnerable, close, crit, all stats. So it's like the best in slot values, but a much lower DPS. So again, this is 2083 DPS. This is 2534. So if you compare these, it's a 21.6% DPS difference from the 50 item power here. So that is pretty significant, but not unbeatable with those stats. I mean, there is 42 vulnerable damage. That alone already gives you a pretty massive bonus. So again, we can take a calculation here. We have the vulnerable damage here right now, 212 bonus. So we do 100 plus 212. And then again, we divide this by a value that is 42 lower. So this would be 270. So you see here that if the target is vulnerable, this vulnerable damage roll alone already gives plus 15% DPS. That's a pretty massive value. And then comes the crit, and then comes the close. So again, the close here would be something like a plus 10% or so, because we said that this rogue has like 700% additive or so. So it's pretty straightforward, 700 over 360, 11%. And then again, the crit, we said that the smaller value on the sword was worth something like 5% DPS. So in this case, the doubled value would be around 10% DPS. So if you add up all these, like 10 plus 11 plus like 15, the stats alone here are worth something like 36% DPS. So if you take this 2083 damage per second and then we multiply it by 1.36, we would actually need to have a weapon with basically no stats that has 2832 DPS, and that doesn't really exist. So this 750 crossbow like beats this 800 crossbow with really bad stats by a mile. And again, we have kind of like the same, like, you know, roughly 15 to 20 item power per stat ballpark range, where, yeah, if you have some stats like this that just, you know, mostly do nothing for your build, then you probably want to use a lower one that has all the good rolls. Let's go into the next example here of the Sorcerer. So I've prepared 2 ones for this one. And again, I mentioned that, you know, the values are a bit different, especially vulnerable damage is very different on the sword because you have so much less access to vulnerable damage, for example. But we are comparing these 2 ones. Here's an 800 item power wand that has 1267 DPS and then has all stats, distant, crit, core. Versus a 760 wand that has all stats, vulnerable, crit, core. So basically replace one stat. We have the distant damage 35%, and this is a Frozen Orb build, so we're going to assume that distant damage is very valuable because you're generally far away with Frozen Orb, and here is vulnerable, 21%. So first of all, let's look at the value of this vulnerable stat roll. So we have 21%, and our current value is 132 without that weapon equipped. So we take 100 plus 132. This is our vulnerable damage done. And now we have another item that has plus 21. So we do plus 21 divided by this value. This means that this vulnerable roll against a vulnerable target is a 9% damage increase. So 9%, and everything else is kind of unchanged. But here's also distant damage. Now you have to calculate the value of the distant damage. Again, we said the sword here has something like 800% additive or so. So this means that we have to calculate 800 divided by a number minus 35%. So this would be 4.5% from this distant damage roll. Now that is not really much, and distant is also not always active. For example, there are cases where enemies rush to you and you actually have to defeat it in close combat, or you have suppressors, or you have to run in and do a Frost Nova and then do Ice Shards or something like that. So I would attribute maybe like 2/3 of this value to this distant damage roll. So 2/3 of 4.5 is 3%. So let's say the distant damage is worth roughly 3% DPS versus the 9% from the vulnerable. And now let's look at the DPS. So we have 1267 and 1084. So there is a DPS difference of 180. And we also have to factor in the offhand here. This is kind of like a dual wield build. So similar to the rogue. So we add up those DPS values. We have 1370 from the offhand, and we have 1267 from the main hand. So this is our DPS value right now, 2637. And now we divide this by a number that is minus 180 of this. So that would be 57. Yeah, so 2457, this is minus 180. And you see that the DPS difference with those two items is 7.3%. So this is actually a really close case here. So we said the vulnerable is worth 9%, the distant is worth 3%, and the DPS value difference is 7.3. So this is actually one of those cases where, you know, it's really close. And that is despite this higher item power weapon still having an okay stat in this distant damage. So this is actually something that works for this build, and it's not like overpower or damage too slow that you can't even trigger here and these kind of things. This is distant damage on a Frozen Orb build, which is actually kind of desirable. But you see, because the Sorcerer has so low vulnerable damage, this impact of this vulnerable damage stat is just so high. And then again comes the fact that you have this dual wield, so you have to factor in both of the DPS values in a calculation. And it's actually not such a big deal if one of your items has a bit less DPS, because the other one can kind of like pull it up, so to say. I guess it's like even more important for offense, where you have the same DPS calculation, but it's really difficult to find a good offhand that has, you know, crit, cooldown, resource, or something like that, like this. And, well, it's not too unlikely they're gonna end up with something like a 750 offhand that has all the right stats, or like a 770 or something, and then sometimes you find like an 800 plus that has really high DPS, but it only has like 1 or 2 good stats. And finally, I want to do one last example with the barb here. So that's the Kratos barb, and here I created another weapon. We have an 820 two-handed axe that has, all stats, strength, crowd control damage, and injured damage. And then we have an 780 axe that has all stats, strength, crit, wound. So again, kind of like a GG 4 out of 4 780 weapon here. And we have our 820 with, at least 2 stats that are kind of not really doing anything. Both of them don't really work on a boss because this build is designed to one-shot bosses and just one-shot stuff in general, I guess. So the injured damage is generally very weak. And the crowd control damage, it is kind of easy to trigger with a hamstring passive, but also not really up all the time. So considering how infrequently both these stats actually activate, so I would say that this damage to injured would be maybe the equivalent of something like plus 21% close damage, for example, or plus 21% all damage or something like that. like some much more universally applicable damage stats instead of, you know, these very, very conditional effects. So they're both really weak on this build. But let's see. So we have 2,741 DPS and we have 2,343 DPS. So let's look at the values here again. So we divide them, and then we see that when we attack with this weapon, we have a 17% DPS difference from the weapon alone. So the lower item power stats need to beat 17% damage increase. And let's see, our vulnerable damage here right now is 292%. So again, we do 100 plus 292. So this is our vulnerable damage. And then we have this divided by a value that is 42% less. So this would be 350. So the vulnerable damage stat alone is worth roughly 12% DPS here. And then similar with the crit, we can do that. We have crit is 377. So again, plus 100. So on the crit, we do roughly quintuple damage. And this is a value of 52%. So we divide this by 425. So the crit on the crit damage stat on a crit is worth roughly 12% DPS. So you see here, we're already looking at like something like 25% DPS or something like that, just from those two stats on a crit. So on non-crits, this is a bit less. So, you know, you don't get this crit damage bonus, but you still have the vulnerable that almost makes up for this entire DPS difference from the weapon alone. Now, you have to see that on the barb, for example, you can also just have stat sticks though. So for example, you can play a build that is not a walking arsenal build like this, and let's say Hoda or Whirlwind, and you just don't use your slashing weapon, right? So this is an axe, and it is a slashing weapon, and you can just choose to just use your bludgeoning weapon, for example. And in that case, the DPS value of your axe doesn't matter at all, and the only thing that matters is the stats. So that's why it's called a stat stick. It's kind of similar for some rogue builds. If you play like a ranged rogue build, then your melee weapons are entirely stat sticks. You don't care about the damage. And similar, if you play a melee build, then you have the crossbow and you don't care about the DPS there. But this is kind of like a special case of these two classes here. For all other classes, the DPS of the weapon always matters. But in this case, yeah, if you're using only the bludgeoning weapon for your Hoda build, then of course the 780 axe would be significantly better, because only these stats matter. But the bottom line here is that this 780 axe actually beats this 820 axe, because there's two almost entirely useless stats for this build. There's all stats, there's strength, which are nice, and then there's these crowd control and damage to injured. Both of these are just really weak. And I would definitely say that if that was my character, I would use the 780 axe here. And this is a item power difference of 40. So we have, you know, this rule of thumb that I mentioned earlier, with like 15 to 20 item power per stat that you're missing. And well, in some of those cases where you miss those really powerful stats like vulnerable and crit damage, those are, you know, way above most of the other stats in terms of value. I would say that rule of thumb is probably more like 25 to 30. So maybe for like, you know, close damage, core skill damage, etc., like around 15 item power is fine. And then if you have these more valuable stats, it's like roughly double the value or so. So this is maybe kind of how you can, you know, take this as a rule of thumb and then decide, okay, is this an item that I want to wear? Now, to sum this up, I do have to say that it's not always 100% obvious which weapon you should choose, and it comes down to having a bit of an understanding of how builds work. You need to understand like how much crit works, like how much value it has for you, how much is vulnerable up, or how much vulnerable damage do you have on your build. You know, some classes like the barbs, you see this vulnerable damage value is significantly higher than on a sorcerer, for example. You know, this is like almost double basically in terms of like how much damage you gain against vulnerable targets. And in this case, when you have very low vulnerable damage, but you have high vulnerable uptime, then vulnerable has a much higher value than on the barb. And similarly, a lot of barb builds actually have trouble applying vulnerable consistently. Not this one, but other builds do. And in that case, yeah, even though vulnerable is such a powerful stat, it may just not be really worth sticking it all that much over other stats, or really prioritizing it so much over other stats. So you have to kind of understand like how often are these conditions met? How often do you have vulnerable? How often are you at a distance, for example, for this distance damage here? And how often do you stays a target, for example, for this dagger here that we had. So there are these different cases where, yeah, some of these are very conditional effects and they have much lower value because of those conditions, or you have just not really this vulnerable uptime, this crit chance that you need for these stats to become really desirable. And you also need to understand like how much additive damage do you actually have in your build. So again, most builds kind of end up naturally with something like 600, 700, 800% or so of this additive damage category, which includes all this like elite, crowd control, daze, close, physical, core, whatever. All the stuff is in the same category, and you have to kind of like understand that this belongs together. And then, you know, a 35% damage to close enemies is not a 35%, you know, damage increase. It's like, you know, much less than that, maybe 5% or so. This is kind of the value of these stats. The good news is you don't always have to like load your entire character into the 4-planner and then, you know, try to figure it out, you know, down to the last detail. Most of the time the choices are relatively obvious and napkin math is enough. So I never really just sit down and start calculating, okay, is this sword like, you know, 1% DPS better than the other sword or something like that. Most of the time it's pretty obvious. You see here, you know, overpower, daze, you know, 2 pretty useless stats. Like this is definitely an item that I will quite easily replace with a bit more grinding. So eventually I'm gonna find like a 770 sword or 780 sword that has like 3 good stats, and I roll the last one to something else that's good, and I'm gonna be happy with that for a while until I find like maybe a similar one that is like another, you know, plus 20 or 30 item power from there or so. And most of the time on the higher end, once you actually have acquired a few good pieces, you can just hold onto them for a while. Now you have to see that all the stuff that I just explained is a bit different on the lower levels. So here I was looking at level 100 characters, you know, mostly optimized with all the glyphs level 21. So they add a lot of, you know, crit damage here, for example. They add a lot of like additive damage here from these kind of glyphs. So this is where a lot of this comes from. And for example, if you're like level 70, level 80 or something, or level 60, most of your glyphs will not be leveled. This means you have much less additive damage. And if you find like a good ancestral sword when you're just like fresh into Torment, and that thing has like core damage, close damage, and you don't have any of your glyphs leveled, then instead of like 700, 800% additive damage, you have maybe only 300 on your entire build. So the value at that stage in the game is probably roughly doubled or so. But again, this is kind of like how the progression just naturally changes the value of these different stats. And most of the time, when it comes to progressing through the end game and getting to 100, you just have like so much, you know, like turnover of your different items that doing this like min-max calculations is not exactly worth it. Like I never do that. I just equip whatever kind of like looks good. I try to do a bit of napkin math, and then I know, okay, this is probably better than the other one, and I just keep going until I find something better. And another thing is that the lower you are with a character level, the more the DPS has an impact on your overall performance. You have to always remember the damage of your weapon is the base for everything. This is where the damage calculations start, unless you're playing a build like Leap Quake or something like that. These like legendary effects that trigger like a flat damage value. Obviously they are separate from this, they don't care about your weapon damage, but basically 98% of the builds in the game do care about weapon damage first and foremost. And this is even more prominent at lower levels, because at that point, all these stats actually have just much lower value. And it's much easier to find a weapon that has higher DPS, and it doesn't really matter what kind of stats it has. Like if you're level 20 and you find a bow, it can easily be something like double the DPS of your previous bow or something like that, because there's these much larger jumps in DPS values on the lower levels compared to on the higher levels where, you know, post, let's say, item power 600 or so, these DPS values don't really rise all that much anymore, and the stats become much more important as you go higher and higher. I know this was a pretty long video now, so I hope you could take something away from this. Again, this rule of thumb is, yeah, like 15 to 30 item power on a weapon per, you know, either good or bad stat. So depending on like how valuable a certain stat is, this is kind of like the range of how much extra DPS you need to get on your weapon to make a bad stat worth it. So this means that also very often, for example, unique items can definitely become quite valuable. Like, for example, Condemnation is a very prominent dagger that many rogue builds use. It's a very powerful effect, a very powerful weapon that you want to have on a combo point build. And it's definitely worth using this, even with a lower item power. when you have a good roll on all of these stats, and especially the legendary effect. So there are those cases where you can even go further than this rule of thumb and have a lower item power weapon equipped, but it always depends a bit on the exact case, on the exact build. How much of those, crit stats do you have? How much vulnerable do you have? How much of these additive damage categories do you have? So I try to explain a little bit like what is the thought process behind comparing these items. I try to give like the calculation of how you actually figure out how much is one stat worth it or how much is a DPS worth it. And I hope that you can take something away from this for yourself. Let me know if you enjoyed this video or if you want to see more like this, maybe for another topic of, how can you compare items, etc. I'll be quite curious, and maybe I'll make a follow-up on this for other stats or for other types of items or something like that. Hope you like this, and see you guys next time.